So I want to begin our learning this morning by looking actually at the very first Aliyah that we heard chanted this morning, where we have a very emotional experience for Jacob, the patriarch, who hears from his sons that Joseph, his beloved, Joseph, who he has thought dead for decades, is alive and well and within reach. Joseph is living in Egypt. The brothers have been there receiving rations, and Joseph has now invited them to come to Egypt to live with him in safety through the remainder of the famine. And the brothers go, they have little wagons that Joseph has sent with them to carry all of the family's worldly possessions. And when we began our Torah chanting this morning, we learned that Jacob, or Israel, does in fact set out with all that is his, and he comes to Beersheba, and there he offers sacrifices to God, the God of his father Isaac. And God calls out to Israel, who's in this moment called Israel, in a vision in the middle of the night. And what does God say to him? Jacob, Jacob. And Jacob says, Hineni. We always know when there's a Hineni in the Torah, it's asking us to pay attention. And God says, I am God, the God of your father's house. Al tira, do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you there into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back. And Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. Reading this with a plain first read, you might pause and ask, when did we hear that Joseph was afraid? Sorry, Jacob. When did we hear that Jacob was afraid? In what moment did we have any kind of question that he was fearful? And our commentators, our rabbis, in particular the medieval rabbis, pick up on exactly this question and say, oh, it must be because no one in the Bible has ever been told by God not to be afraid unless they already were afraid. This is Chizkuni, one of the commentators I'm going to speak about today, who says, okay, we have to fill in the blank here. It must be that Jacob is afraid, and therefore we have to figure out what he is afraid of. And I want to spend some time on the various opinions of our medieval rabbis about what it is that Jacob must have feared, because it kind of reads like a projection of all of our own fears and anxieties that we could possibly imagine backwards on the Jewish people of the past. So just to spell that out very clearly, in this moment where Jacob is about to leave the promised land, remember, he's the third generation that in theory is fulfilling this promise. And now he seems to be leaving that promise behind. And God says to him, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to leave the land that you have been promised. And in fact, our rabbis say, well, there are a number of things that Jacob must have been afraid of in this moment. Chizkuni says, well, he was probably afraid because he knew that this was the beginning of this process of being a stranger in a foreign land. He knew the prophecy that they would be slaves that had already been decreed in his lifetime. His grandfather Abraham had been told that, and the Brit HaBetarim, the Brit Bein HaBetarim was this moment many chapters ago in the book of Genesis, where Abraham is told, your people are going to go down to Egypt and they're going to sojourn there for 400 years. So now we're having this vision from Chizkuni that it must have been that in the family lore, they knew eventually this day would come. And for Jacob, when he hears that his son Joseph is in fact in Mitzrayim and that he will be relocating to be there, this is the beginning of the fulfillment of that prophecy. And maybe rightfully so, he is scared. He says, or Chizkuni rather says, that he is fearful of what it will be like to actually live this promised experience of enslavement. Very, very reasonable read of what you too might fear if you had heard an age-old prophecy of suffering and you felt yourself to be at the beginning of that journey. Rashi, another medieval commentator from France in this case, says, well, it must be that he is stuck on the idea that he wasn't supposed to leave the land. His father Isaac had been told that he should never leave the land of Canaan. That's why a servant was sent to get his wife Rebekah from elsewhere. And God had to explain to him, no, it's okay for you to leave. You're not sort of breaking the promise. You're not going to be a rupture in this family story. Another commentator, Italian Sforno, says, well, I'm going to make you a great nation there. Whereas if you remained here in Canaan, you actually might have a chance of intermarrying with the Canaanites. In Egypt, where the Egyptians won't even eat with the Hebrews, which we saw one chapter ago with Joseph and his family, where he sits them separate from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians have a practice of not eating or mixing with the Hebrews. Sforno says, you're going to be sort of remaining a people in Egypt in a way that I can't guarantee in Canaan. And so this will actually be a positive experience of people formation for you outside of the land. Counterintuitive, and yet very interesting. And you can hear the kind of Jewish thinking in this, like, how is it that we will have this experience of being a people, a minority among others, and still maintain our unique peoplehood? Ha'emek Davar says, do not fear that your descendants are going to be absorbed into the Egyptian way of life. I will be with them in Egypt to keep them distinctive, and I will lead them out. And even more forceful in the Hebrew, he says, Be'eretz Yisrael makom mekudash la'avodat korbanot v'gam yuchad lechochmat haTorah yoter mikol ha'aretzot yichol lihiyot mishmorat nekudah ha'Yisraeli ledor vador. He says, in Eretz Yisrael, this is a holy and sanctified place where the service of the korbanot take place. And also this is a very special place for all of the wisdom of the Torah, greater than all of the other places. And that is the place, in theory, where you can preserve this Jewishness, lidor vador. This, the rabbis are picking up on, is our core impulse as Jewish people, to try to preserve our peoplehood across generation, across time, and in this parsha in particular, across location. That is the story that the rabbis project onto this moment, where Jacob is sitting in his anxiety and fear, and where we, the reader, don't actually know what he's afraid of. Now, I want to hold all of that anxiety. I imagine that it feels relevant. I hope that among those commentators, you can see some of the threads of your own thinking, your own concerns as contemporary Jewish people who wonder about the Jewish future. I want to hold all of that, and then I want to look back at the original Torah text. And I want to just teach very briefly this idea of pshat. Have any of you heard of pshat? You raise your hand if you know what pshat is. Okay, pshat is the plain meaning of the text. Now, the academic trick that you have to know is that we're told that Rashi, the medieval commentator, was a master of pshat and that he gave us the plain meaning of all the text. But Rashi is actually drenched in midrash. He often is bringing many outside stories in order to explain the Torah to us. And later commentators, even Rashi's grandson, come along often and say, that thing Rashi said, it actually came from somewhere else in the tradition, and it's not the plain meaning of the Torah. So with pshat in mind, with trying to get at the plain meaning of the Torah in mind, I want to look back at the verses that I read to you at the beginning. God's promise to Jacob Jacob, Jacob, I am God, the God of your father's house. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will make you there a great nation. I myself will go down to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. This final line, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes, to me is actually the key that unlocks this story. And we realize potentially in this moment where Jacob has lived with so long with the very human grief of thinking that his son is lost, he is all of the sudden faced with the possibility of seeing him again. And I don't know if you all have had an experience that I have often experienced in people who are either sick or actually sometimes having a potentially very good moment in their lives, and they find themselves in great fear and trepidation. So I was just with a friend who was saying, my life is so good right now, and then every time my spouse leaves to go to his job, I become consumed with fear that he's going to get into a car accident. Before you sort of balk at that, this is actually a really normal thing that people do. We fixate on things going wrong in exactly the moment when they're good, because there is something about that feeling of loving something so much and really feeling like we need it in order to survive, that the fear of losing it becomes overwhelming. And the only way we can imagine the next step is actually imagining the much more tangible thing, which would be death or loss, than living a reality where we actually get the things we love and we get on some level to keep them. Humans are wise, we know. We always lose the things we love eventually. And yet, in the moments when we are experiencing them and feeling them in our lives, those are the moments we should treasure, and not the moments that we should think ahead to loss. And so, what do I think is the pshat of what Jacob's worst fear is in this moment? It's the fear that he's not actually going to get to see his son. And so God's promise to him has nothing to do with the promise about the sort of epic historical questions of who the Jewish people will be. It's about Jacob as a person, and Jacob as a person that all of us can relate to, who at the end of the day is a person who loves his child and whose greatest fear is that he'll lose him once again. And so God gives him this incredible gift and says, you are going to end your life. Joseph, the son you loved and lost, is going to be there at your bedside. He'll be the one who closes your eyes. And I want us to sit with the beauty and the simplicity and the heartbreak of how all of us actually at our core are human, who have very human fears and very personal loves, and who often have so much story and history that gets heaped on top of our very essential truths, which are that the things we love the most are things we fear losing. And if we can just imagine for a moment that God's grace will be with us and that we can appreciate the moments that we have and love them fully, that is a recipe for joy and happiness, even though we know everything could be lost. And with that, we will continue our service.